And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Hello and welcome to the program of Shavuot, a spring harvest festival, but chiefly celebrating the day on which Moses presented the Ten Commandments to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. It is a joyful festival, but unfortunately this year celebrated with mixed emotions. Thankfully, Israel is now beginning to recover from the effects of the corona pandemic. Restrictions are being successively lifted and life is slowly returning to normal. Well, not quite. The Gaza-based terrorist organization Hamas, backed by Qatar and Iran, sees to it that we are not getting any respite. Hamas has decided to test Israel's resolve to respond to attack, and under the pretext of support for the events in Jerusalem's Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood, or Sheikh Jarrah by its Arabic name, the riots within Israel started. The world's media repeated the false Palestinian Arab story that Arab residents of the area are being evicted and the property is being given to Jews. I can do no better than let the columnist for the London Times explain. She is Melanie Phillips and is stationed in Jerusalem.
Every part of this narrative is a complete lie, and it's a lie that's being fed to Western media audiences in Britain, in America, in Australia, and elsewhere. On the claim about these houses in Sheikh Jarrah, this neighborhood in Jerusalem, the situation is this. These Palestinian Arab residents are the tenants of an Israeli Jewish organization which owns the properties. The predecessor Arab tenants have also been the tenants of an Israeli Jewish organization because the properties in question have been in Jewish legal ownership really since the middle of the 19th century, with one big exception, which was the period between 1948 and 1967, when Jordan illegally occupied these territories and illegally sequestered the land, expelled all the Jewish inhabitants, expelled the Jewish residents of these houses, and sequestered the territory, sequestered the properties. Subsequently, when Jerusalem was reunified by the Israelis, Jews returned to legal, rightful ownership of their properties. They still had Arab tenants. The Arab tenants agreed in writing that the Jews were entitled to own these properties.
Stay tuned to hear the bottom line.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
The Arab tenants agreed in writing that the Jews were entitled to own these properties. What's produced this threatened eviction of these tenants is that they are refusing to pay their rent and instead are illegally expanding their properties. In other words, it's a rent dispute between landlord and tenant. The idea that this caused this conflagration is ludicrous. What the media have failed to report is that this tension, this violence, is the result of an incitement which has been going on for weeks. At the beginning of Ramadan, there was the beginning of incitement by the Palestinian Authority, by Hamas, calling Palestinian Arabs to holy war, as a result of which there were attacks on Jews in Jerusalem in the streets, requiring hospitalizations, attacks on the light railway. There were attempts to arrest them. There were then violent disturbances by the Arabs. And what then happened as Ramadan proceeded was that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the supposedly holy place for Muslims, was turned into a theatre of war. Weapons were stockpiled there, rocks, petrol bombs, and they began to be thrown down from the Al-Aqsa compound onto Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall just below, onto the police. Eventually, the Israeli police went in, and there were battles in the mosque, unprecedented. I mean, this is a place which Israel considers so incendiary. It forbids Jews from going there, and it forbids Jews from praying there. It forbids Jews from going there from time to time, and it always forbids Jews from praying there. It's Jews Jews who are prevented from having their religious rights at that place. Again, the Israeli police went in because the place was being used as a site of attempted murder. Subsequently, the incitement went on. You had the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah grouping, whose head is Mahmoud Abbas, who the West insists on regarding as a man of peace and a potential statesman in waiting, inciting Palestinian Muslims to holy war. And as I think you may yourself have referred to, this extraordinary broadcast by the senior Hamas operative saying explicitly, cut the throat of the Jews, and this is a holy war against what he called Jews and polytheists, which I believe is a kind of euphemism for Christians. So that's what we're in here. We're in an Islamic holy war incited by Mahmoud Abbas and the Hamas, and being sanitized, misrepresented quite wickedly by the Western media to make, once again, Israel, which is the victim of this holy war, seem the aggressor, and the aggressor seem the victim.
About the EU's and Washington's attitude to all that, she had this to say.
First of all, the European Union and before President Trump's administration were funding Palestinian Arab terror against Israel and Israeli Jews, in that they were giving the Palestinians money, and on the basis this was for educational purposes. And the money was being used either directly or indirectly to produce an absolutely unstoppable torrent of both anti-Israel and anti-Jewish hatred. Palestinian children, now adults and their children, are taught basically from the cradle to hate Jews, but not just to hate Israel. They're taught that the whole of Israel should be theirs, and they're taught that their highest aspiration is to fight Israelis and conquer cities like Haifa and so on and so forth, Jaffa. They're also taught to hate Jews very explicitly, using Nazi-type imagery of the most grotesque kind. Now, this is never, ever reported in the Western media, but this is where Western money is going to. President Trump put a stop to that, but the Biden administration has restored the money. The Biden administration has basically signaled that it wants to re-empower Iran. It wants to rejoin the nuclear deal, that it will once again be helping funnel billions of dollars into Iranian coffers to enable it to pursue its nefarious activities. All this has given a signal to the Palestinians that they can get away with anything.
To date, Hamas has fired more than 2,500 rockets and occasional anti-tank shells at Israel. This is, of course, nothing new, but this time they have increased the intensity and range, reaching to the Tel Aviv area. There have been Israeli casualties, including several deaths. Israel's response, though measured, has also been stronger than in the past, with what seems targeted killings of senior Hamas leaders, as well as intensified aerial bombardment. Yet the consensus of opinions expressed by the Israeli public shows dissatisfaction with Israel's reaction. The continuous piecemeal reaction to the intermittent rocket attacks during past years is interpreted by the enemy as weakness, and hence the brazen intensity of their attacks. The two-faced leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, looked upon as peaceful by the international community, is reported as having encouraged the Arab riots with Israel. Quote, "There is no peace, security or stability except with a full liberation from the occupation and its return to the Palestinian people," he said. "Our people have spoken and we support them. We want a future without aggression, without settlements, and without settlers." He went on in a tirade against the occupying state, whipping up emotions of the Israeli Arab population. The brunt of the rocket attacks is borne by the villages and towns situated within a few kilometers of the border with Gaza. This week, together with the Foreign Press Corps, I visited the city of Ashkelon following a heavy attack on the city, and I am standing by a house that has received a direct hit and sustained devastating damage. The hole in the roof where the rocket entered is clearly visible. Unfortunately, the 40-year-old Indian caregiver, Soumya Santosh, for the Holocaust survivor, she was killed and her 90-year-old employer sustained serious injuries. It is reported that the old lady's mobility problems prevented them from reaching shelter in time. The organization Zaka, usually staffed by Orthodox Jews and known for its presence and help at disaster areas anywhere in the world, is also active here in the south of the country. The Zaka operative responsible for this area is Mr. Yossi Landau, who ensures that all persons are accounted for.
We come and try to save lives, and unfortunately, if God forbid, there's nothing to save, then we will handle that situation by giving the full respect to the people that got killed or something like that.
Can you tell me any more about the casualties in this house?
In this house, we had one person dead, and we were here on the scene when it happened, and now we're here to make sure there's no more casualties.
Here is what the mayor of Ashkelon had to say, and for the sake of accuracy, I bring it in Hebrew, and you can also hear a brief translation in English by his spokesman. Mr. Mayor, do you think it's now time that the IDF will go into Gaza and finish it off once and for all? And what will you say to our Prime Minister now? Our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, always tells to Hamas, now, if you don't behave yourself, we are coming in. And then they stop. And next time, say, start again. And then he'll say, well, if you don't stop now, we're coming in. And nothing seems to be happening.
אוקיי, השאלה, אדוני ראש העיר, זה האם אתה חושב שזה הגיע הזמן שצבא ההגנה לישראל ייכנס קרקעית לרצועת עזה ויסיים אחת ולתמיד את מה שקורה שם?
כמו שאמרתי, בכל מדינה מתוקנת, המצב הזה לא היה נמשך. ולכן לכל תרחיש ולכל מערכה שתצטרך לקבל גיבוי מהשלטון המקומי, מראש העיר, מהאזרחים, ניתן את הגיבוי לכל מערכה שתצטרך כדי לעצור את הטרור הנבזה הזה.
The current situation is something that no normal country would tolerate, and therefore the city of Ashkelon and the residents of Ashkelon give full support for any campaign that is needed to put an end to this situation in the long term.
אמרתי, מה שאנחנו חושבים על זה, ואמרתי את זה ואני חוזר עוד פעם, הדבר החשוב ביותר זה להכות באותם גורמים שגורמים למוות מיותר ואכזרי של תושבים חפים מפשע, ולא משנה באיזה דרך לעצור את זה, אם זה דרך האוויר, דרך היבשה או דרך הים, העיקר שזה ייגמר ולתמיד. חברים, הילדים בעיר אשקלון מעל 20 שנה, ובשנים האחרונות זה רק הולך ומתעצם. לא רק שהם לא ישנים בזמן הצפירות, זה נכון שזה מעלה את זה כל פעם מחדש. על נפגעי החרדה הם אלפי ילדים שחיים למציאות שהיא לא בריאה ולא תקינה. וכן, זה מפריע בעיקר לילדות ולילדים, ובכלל לכולם. ואם ישנים טוב, גם כשאנחנו בשגרה, אנחנו לא ישנים טוב, מכיוון שאנחנו יודעים שהצד השני, בכל רגע נתון, תוך דקות, יכול להפר את שגרת החיים, וזה דבר שהוא בלתי נתפס.
The children of Ashkelon have been living this reality for more than 20 years now, and they haven't been sleeping, and even when they do sleep, they know that at any moment the situation can deteriorate again. Residents of Ashkelon will give full support to anything that is needed in order to stop this situation, which is simply not something that we should be dealing with.
I doubt if the long-suffering population of Ashkelon will agree with the mayor's patience.
שהוא ברור לכל העולם. כל ילד הוא ילד, ולא משנה אם הוא פלסטיני, נוצרי, יהודי, ומה שקורה פה זה לא רק צריך להקים את מדינת ישראל, אלא את העולם כולו, שצריכים לעסוק ולצעוק את הזעקה, כי כן, המדיניות והמוסריות של מדינת ישראל ושל התושבים, זה לא להוציא את הכל ולהציף לתקשורת. אבל המציאות שהילדים גדלים בה, זה מציאות לא תקינה ולא בריאה, ובשום מדינה, גם את אלה שאתם באים ומסקרים עבורם בתקשורת, הם לא היו מוכנים לחיות במציאות שכזו.
Regarding kids, the reality that they live with is something that doesn't differentiate whether they are Arab or Jews. a kid is a kid, and as the State of Israel, we're moral, so we don't expose the suffering of our children.
Keep it here, there's more.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Kid is a kid, and as the State of Israel, we're moral, so we don't expose the suffering of our children, but it's something that should be taken into account because we've been living with a situation that no normal country and no child anywhere in the world should live with.
In his last sentences, he describes the situation as it could be, and he has some words for Hamas.
ובזמן שהיה את המתיחות, לפני שהתחילה המתיחות, בשנות ה-90 המוקדמות, היה ערבות הדדית. אנחנו היינו נוסעים לעזה, אני זוכר עם אבי זיכרונו לברכה, לעשות את הקניות, עובדים ביחד, עושים שבתות, אחד מגיע לשני. כל זה נגדע באיבו מסיבה אחת, שארגוני הטרור, במקום להשתמש באותם תקציבים, באותם כספים, שמגיעים מכל העולם ומכל האנשים, מכל מיני דמויות כאלה ואחרות, היו משקיעים את המשאבים האלה בתשתיות שלהם, בחינוך, בתרבות, בלעזור ולחזק את הילדים שגרים בעזה, אז המציאות גם שלהם וגם שלנו הייתה נראית אחרת.
As someone who used to, in the 90s, go to Gaza and have just a normal interaction with the people and the kids, and where the reality was completely different, I can say that if Hamas didn't invest in missiles and in rockets and instead invested in education and in the economy and in infrastructure, and the reality here would be completely different.
We also heard the police perspective with regards to the riots by the Israeli Arab population from the National Police spokesman for the foreign media, Mickey Rosenfeld, who admitted that the police was very surprised and did not expect this measure of unrest. Unfortunately, the full recording has been lost. The head of the emergency department at Barzilai Hospital in Ashkelon is Dr. Jonathan Reek, who explained in general terms what they are facing.
I'm prepared to address things generally. I think you'll understand that I can't talk about specifics. Currently, we're into day 3 of this round of hostilities. Barzilai has seen of the order of 110 casualties in one form or another. Most of them have been mild casualties, stress reactions. We've seen of the order of 4 or 5 significant casualties, either as a result of direct rocket strikes or blast injuries associated with the rocket strikes. Currently in the hospital we have of the order of 10 patients who are still being treated, and unfortunately we expect more. As it is, we deal with trauma on a daily basis. I've been an emergency room doctor for about 30 years. I've been at this hospital for 3 years. I was previously in Tel HaShomer. I do remember this sort of level of casualties, and I would very guardedly say that we're thankful that most of the casualties are minor. I don't think at the moment we're seeing anything that's unexpected or not been seen in the past. But we don't know how long it's going to last. The major effort that I make is to try and get a good rotation of staff so that staff don't tire out. That would be the only preparation that we do. I think the preparation is mental. Everybody understands what the situation is. Doctors who aren't here are on call. They understand that, and they can be called in at any moment.
I take it that the space situation is now good because you have hardly any COVID patients now.
The change in the capacity of the hospital to accept patients is due to the fact that we've moved the patients down to the protected area. Pediatrics, neonatal unit, obstetrics are all in missile-proof areas. Now, we don't have as many beds that are in these areas as we would normally have, so that puts a strain. I don't think it's related to COVID, but it's related to the fact that we've moved the patients down to the protected area. Pediatrics, neonatal unit, obstetrics are all in missile-proof areas. Now, we don't have as many beds that are in these areas as we would normally have, so that puts a strain. I don't think it's related to COVID, I think we're happy here that we're not having to deal with war and corona, one thing at a time. Generally, I'd say something. Over the years, what we've seen is an increase in the violence of the ordnance that's been used. Not only in traditionally military weapons where you'd expect it, which is an anti-tank, but also in the missiles that are being fired in the residential areas. I think over the years we've seen that they have more explosive power, so that the injuries are going to be blast injuries, penetrating fragment injuries, injuries to limbs.
What are the difficulties treating injury like that?
It's trauma. Trauma is trauma is trauma. I mean, the fact that it comes from a anti-tank missile or a missile fired into a home, or it's a high-speed vehicle collision, without being too macabre, at the end of the day, it's the same human body that absorbs the energy. So the difficulties we face, severe blood loss, problems with breathing, problems with penetrating injuries, and obviously the challenge of head injuries. It's not something we don't do day to day, we do. It is amplified during this sort of period, A, because of the sort of weapons that are used, and B, because of the intensity of what's going on.
How many patients do you have as a result of this latest terror outbreak?
We've treated over about 100 casualties, most of them minor, currently in the hospital of the order of 10 or 11 patients. You have to understand that the population here is under chronic stress. So what we're seeing most of the time is an acute on chronic exacerbation. These events trigger so that we have patients coming in feeling just incapable of coping. It can be translated to chest pressure symptoms, shortness of breath, dizziness, inability to walk. So then the onus on us is to make sure, first of all, that there's no trauma and there's no medical condition going on, because this sort of situation could also cause exacerbation of existing heart disease. We've seen heart attacks as a result of that.
All that was an overview of what has to be faced after the terror rocket attacks. As I prepare this program this morning, rockets are falling in the south and center of the country. Now for my personal view. Hamas senior leaders are holed up in well-appointed shelters deep underground, from where they conduct operations with little care for the suffering of the ordinary men, women and children in Gaza, who are without adequate shelter. It has to be said that theirs is the initiative, placing Israel on the back foot, having to react to their dictate. And that is why we are in this situation ever since we withdrew from parts of Gaza, of Gush Katif in 2005, and even before. That withdrawal was another occasion interpreted by Hamas that Israel has no stomach to stand its ground. These latest rocket attacks are exploiting Israel's internal political troubles, a country without a government backed by the people, a government disunited and fragmented. What a better time for Hamas to act! Unless Israel conducts a comprehensive ground offensive and is seeking out the heads of the snakes, destroying the total government infrastructure, and install a temporary military administration until total calm is restored, we shall see these attacks occurring at frequent intervals. At the same time, Israel has to care for the welfare of the ordinary population in Gaza. Hopefully, those countries that until now funded the terror organization Hamas will then decide to finance reconstruction and the rehabilitation of the population. As far as the riots within Israel are concerned, only live fire can drive the rioters off the streets. In both cases, we will unfortunately suffer casualties. And I say this with a heavy heart, because I do not have any children in our armed forces, but I am concerned about the safety and security of our one and only Jewish state, Am Yisrael Chai. Here is Lenny Solomon, putting it all in song.
by my window, and what do I behold? But the city of my fathers, Jerusalem of gold. Each mountain tells a story, each stone a tale unfolds. The legacy of a nation 5,000 years old. It's right outside my window, and I can't help but feel an emotion so intense, I know it has to be real. The land of my fathers, the land of my fathers. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they walked through the land of my fathers. By my window, my mind is occupied of decisions that await me in this lifetime ride. The clouds are slowly parting, the message becomes clear. We're in Yerushalayim, grasp the Torah that is here. It beckons me to follow in the steps of those before. It's the path of the righteous, it will always endure. The land of my fathers, the land of my fathers. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they walked through the land. The land of my fathers is calling out to me like it did to many others throughout history. You could live your whole life not knowing where to face, but a trip to this country puts everything in place.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
I can see a great similarity between the attitude and actions of the Nazi leaders in the final days of the battle for the defense of Berlin and the Hamas leadership. Both remained holed up in their bunkers. Both showed no concern for the fate of their population that were made homeless. Both decided to fight to the very end, knowing that all is lost, and both would not face their decimated population. The Nazis committed suicide, and I predict the same for the Hamas leadership. As for our well-meaning president's long campaign for peaceful coexistence with our Arab population, which he hoped would be his legacy, that has been shown to be a mirage that manifested itself in the very last days of his 6-year-long presidency. I hope that our leadership will no longer allow Hamas to call the shots, excuse the pun, but eliminate them once and for all. The international community bears a heavy responsibility fueling the current situation. They support the so-called Aid Organization for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, against the honest efforts of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. This United Nations Works and Relief Agency, UNRWA, operates under false pretenses while supporting Hamas, or better, is actually staffed by Hamas in Gaza. It runs their schools and indoctrinates their youth with a false narrative of the history of this country. And now a word about the world's accusation of Israel. By the time you hear this program, we will have received 3,000 rockets in the past 8 days, in addition to a number of anti-tank shells targeting cars, etc. Now I ask you, what would the US do if every day an average of 375 rockets were fired from Mexico at your cities, towns and villages? How would Germany react if it were daily attacked with rockets from Holland? Would they not retaliate? And one more thing. Have you ever heard that a country at war would telephone the residents of buildings it will target so that they can get out? Yes, in some cases an hour before, which of course also gives the Hamas, who occupies a part of these premises, the opportunity to remove their important items. In some cases, Israel drops harmless bombs onto the roof to give a warning. Who else would do that? The media organizations Associated Press and the Al Jazeera, who had offices in the tall building that was destroyed this week, have the gall to say that they were not aware of any Hamas officers occupying a part of the building. That is really thick, coming from news hounds whose job it is to investigate everything that's going on in that small strip called Gaza. By the way, they too had a warning for all their staff to leave. Would the US Armed Services or any other country's army store weapons in private houses, under schools, or even in kindergartens? There is irrefutable proof of that, because when Israel attacks such buildings, you can invariably see secondary explosions, which are rockets and ammunition exploding. That is a war crime, and so is placing rocket launchers in schoolyards and among private houses. It is only the care and accuracy of Israel's planes that prevent more casualties. Hamas, on the other hand, is firing indiscriminately into Israel's population centers with the intention of killing civilians. Why is it that despite those many missiles, Israel has suffered only 10 dead, whereas in Gaza the number is reported in excess of 200? I'll tell you why. 120 of them were terrorists deliberately targeted. 20 were killed by rockets that landed within Gaza. And whereas Israel builds bomb shelters and safe rooms in most buildings, Hamas built attack tunnels with sophisticated communication systems and weapon stores. That's why they have more casualties. Hamas does not care to protect the civilian population. In Israel's frontline areas, school lessons are held in bomb shelters. In Gaza, schools are weapons storage places. On past occasions, Israel capitulated to international pressure and agreed to cease fire before the intended task was complete. That gave Hamas time to recover, to regroup, and rearm, ready to start another round of attacks at their chosen time. So far, Prime Minister Netanyahu has resisted calls for a ceasefire, and I hope that he will continue to do so until Hamas will be incapable to recover from our blows. I reiterate, we must install a temporary military administration, which means entering the area and root out the remnants of the terrorist infrastructure. Only then will there be peace from Gaza. I feel sure that large sections of Gaza's long-suffering population would support such a move. Like in all totalitarian regimes, they have to pay lip service to the policy of Hamas or suffer serious consequences. No one here knows who their neighbor is, and opposition means risking their life. In the meantime, Israel still has no permanent government, and efforts by Yesh Atid leader Yair Lapid to form a coalition government have not produced any results. He has until June the 2nd to succeed before the mandate returns to the Knesset, which will probably result in yet another round of elections. At the same time, Naftali Bennett, who leads the Yamina party, is also negotiating with anyone willing to join with him. As usual, it's all about who gets the top job and for how long. Rotating the position of Prime Minister is the most ludicrous idea I've ever heard. It doesn't allow any plans to be completed, as every incumbent will want to follow his own ideas. That's clearly evident from their current discussions. Our country needs unity. Only a united government can deal with the complicated challenges that are facing us. I agree with the idea that whoever will be Prime Minister, foreign policy should be left to Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, he should be the foreign minister, because nobody can do that job any better. And that brings me to the end of today's program. I hope that all my Jewish listeners had a meaningful and joyful Shavuot festival, and to my other loyal and new listeners, have a good and safe week. Let us hope that the 10 Commandments which we heard read will inspire us to better things, and that peace will again reign in this land. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please write to me to walter@israelnewstalkradio.com, and you will always get my personal reply. Oh, and please don't forget to look after your elderly neighbor. He or she will be pleased when you drop in. He'll be pleased when you